Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to wrap up this week with an album review where we go through an entire album track by track, seeing what each song is doing in isolation and it's part of the larger whole. We have checked out the Receiving End of Sirens before, both a track off of this album, the Armistice, and their other album, The Earth Sings Mi Fa Mi. After we finish this, I'll have listened to both of their albums. This was their debut coming out in 2005. The Earth Sings Mi Fa Mi came out in 2007. The only other thing left would be an EP from 2004 that I may end up checking out on my own just to say that I've listened to everything that this band has created. I do have a little bit of context on this one. It says that this band is incredibly notable for creating the sound of progressive post-hardcore that bands going forward would use as inspiration for, but that this is also an album that features Casey Crescenzo, the only album of this group that features Casey. And it's mentioned that some of the sounds on this album will be similar to some of the work that Casey did while in The Deer Hunter, specifically during Act 2. So that's pretty interesting. We have 13 tracks ahead of us, 70 minutes in total. I do have to play this off of YouTube, though, for whatever reason, it's not on streaming services. So we won't have a time here for each individual track, but every track is 4 to 5 minutes in length. None of them really go on too long, except the final track, which is 13 minutes, but I am told there's quite a bit of silence in there, so I wonder if it's a hidden track at the end of that one. Regardless, let's dive into this. We are kicking it off with Prologue, which is 40 seconds long, and because it's YouTube, it's not going to cleanly go into the next track, unfortunately, so there will be a little bit of a hiccup between this and track 2, Planning something. I can't see the title of it. I think it's Planning a Jailbreak. All right, let's kick this off, see what's going on with Between the Hearts in the Synapse. Double timing it already. Fun little bass synth combo in the background. Okay. Lots of build-up. I'm waiting to see where this goes. Okay, breakdown. The instrumentation became all atmosphere to carve out space for the two vocals. Okay. Huh. Dang. All right. I enjoyed that. I think I enjoyed that. I want to enjoy that more, maybe. For those who don't know, post-hardcore is what I would call my home style of music. This is absolutely something I enjoyed, something I grew up with, something I still listen to this day. I enjoy the general sounds on this track. The chorus sounds great. The layered vocals in that final chorus was phenomenal. The verses had a lot of energy to them. I love the punkiness of all of it, but still kind of focusing on more of a harmonic and melodic element. It is everything I enjoy in a solid post-hardcore track while still kind of being progressive too. It doesn't follow the typical structure of verse, chorus, verse, chorus. bridge chorus. We have something a fair bit more linear here, though we do continue to cycle back to a chorus. It's more of like an A, B, C, B, D, B, E, B kind of thing, where we are consistently moving forward through the line, but every once in a while we loop back. We make more progress, but then we loop back. So I enjoy that too. It keeps me on my toes. There's a lot of flexibility in here from the guitarists, from the bassists, from the vocalists. There's like 2 or 3 vocalists in this. The drummer keeps me on my toes. I feel like the drummer didn't really stick with a single idea for more than 2 bars. At any time I felt like we should probably stick with an idea for traditional 4-bar length. It was only 2 bars, and then we'd switch off to something else. I even mentioned that right at the beginning when we shifted from the slower feel into what I would call the double time there. I was like, oh, we're doing double time already. It's like I barely had a chance to get acclimated to this original beat before you've already changed it. And this was pretty consistent throughout the track. The drummer just always wanted to go. And so anytime they would slow it down for a second, it was always half as long as I thought we should stay in that slower time before we contrasted away from it. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff in here that is fresh-ish to me while still being incredibly familiar and enjoyable. But it just doesn't do anything. There's lots of build-up. There's lots of growing anticipation. There's harmonic density and contrast as we push into darker sounds, as we create that tension within the chord progression itself. And it indicates we're moving towards a payoff, a release of some sort. There's sections in this track where we have rising and falling energy, and then we'll sit lower for a little bit, and I would expect us to explode into a higher element, and it just never does. The finale of the song I also felt was a bit of a letdown. I'm really hoping that all of this works together thematically or artistically, where this feeling of failed anticipation, of never quite getting the release that you want or need, is an element of the lyrical ideas. But for the entire song to feel like it's building into something, and it never does, and so I'm figuring, well, it'll just be a really big finale then, and then we don't even get that. In fact, we get the opposite of that, a type of low energy catharsis that eventually gets overshadowed and fizzled out with compression, just kind of dissipates even that minimal element. It's just really interesting to listen to this not really go anywhere, despite constantly telling me it's ready to go somewhere, and then lays on the ground instead of leaves the door. It's like, bro, don't get me excited and then, flake out on me. And that's what the song does to me. So I'm kind of curious where all of this goes eventually, what the album's going to be looking at, and what the lyrics for this track in particular are going to be focusing on, given my dissatisfaction on the general side of things, even though I enjoyed most of the individual moments. On the topic of the individual moments, I've already kind of touched on some of this. The vocal work on this is phenomenal. There's like 2 or 3 vocalists, and I'm really enjoying all of their contributions. For the most part, they're all kind of in the same realm of vocal delivery. They're all forward projected. They're all a bit of a mid to higher range for masculine vocals. It's the typical sort of soft emo-ish kind of sound. We had 1 or 2 syllables that kind of pushed a little bit into grit, kind of moving into a shouting or a heavily supported sound. I think that was mostly for emphasis, more so than leaning into aggression or anything like that, just to really emphasize those moments. But all of this just comes across as incredibly melodious and gorgeous. And especially when you look at the end of this track, where I think we only have 2 of the vocalists there creating that harmony, but it's just serene. And so all the vocal work on this is fantastic. We did get a taste of vocal counterpoint in here, which is multiple vocalists doing different things. We had one vocalist in the background kind of holding out a note, and then a little bit of movement, and then holding out another note while the vocalist on top sung the chorus, if I remember that correctly. I hope to see more of this, maybe a little bit more expanded too. We did get something in the breakdown, I think it was, where the two vocalists were doing their totally own things, both of them having moving melodic lines, and the rest of the instruments kind of broke it down to a very simple atmospheric foundational idea. We had like double bass kick, eighth notes from the drums, and I think that was about it. The bass and the guitars were just like eighth notes on a chord. The bass was doing pedal tone, just complete foundation, nothing melodic, nothing intricate, just kind of create an atmosphere for these two vocalists to do their thing and carving out space for this counterpoint. So I'd like to hear more of that. I really enjoyed that aspect of the track. And I like how they built into it as well. There's a lot of sections with just one vocalist, I believe, or maybe a vocalist and like secondary vocalist who would add in lines between sentences for the main one. I vaguely remember parts of that. But then we got the vocalist holding out the notes in the background, kind of being part of the atmosphere with the lead vocalist. And then we had the totally unique two lines. So we kind of built up into this idea of vocal complexity. But I am looking forward to more phenomenal vocal work here, harmonized or counterpoint. They're just killing it. I do like the guitar work on this too. The bass is doing some cool stuff. You know, the only time I really heard them doing something boring was when everybody did something boring to carve out the space for that vocal counterpoint. So the rest of the time though, the bass is doing moving bass lines. There's cool slides in there, little cool textures. Feels like it's finger picked most of the time, but there's also some picking going on as well. There's just some harsher and some softer stuff coming out of the bass, which is pretty interesting. Maybe I'm just hearing things, but it's very unusual to see a bassist not choose to finger pick or use a plastic pick. Bassists just usually pick one. So it's interesting to hear both of them here. The guitarists have some very cool lines and riffs all throughout this track. And then we have the synth in the background too that's doing a lot of texture stuff. A lot of it ends up feeling very twinkly and, I don't know, spacious. Very textured though, not really adding much to the melody, but certainly adding emotion to everything. And as I've already mentioned, the drummer's doing whatever they find interesting, man. It's every 2 bars, every 8 beats, they're like, let's change it up a little bit. And so that's cool. We did have a breakdown in there to sort of change up the general scheme. A lot of the instrumentation is kind of do whatever you want. We have a melody from the bass, we have a chordal thing on this guitar and a lead line on this guitar, and the synth is sort of panning from one side to another with these twinkling sounds, and the vocalists have their own melodies, and it's just like stacks of melodies all on top of each other. And so the breakdown's like, well, all right, let's just focus everyone in. Here's one rhythm, pick a note, play the rhythm, and we're just kind of locked down a little bit. Then we get the guitar off to the side, and then everything flattens out so that we can have the dual vocals. So I do enjoy the little bit of variety we heard there, because other than that breakdown, 90% of the track is based around this idea of layered melodies. And I think you can see this most clearly at the end of the track as they continue to sing that song about the last night. I don't remember what they were saying, but they just repeat that line over and over and over. You have this group vocal doing this harmony, and it starts out with atmospheric guitar, atmospheric synth, straightforward drumming, straightforward bass. Then the bass gets more complex and a new guitar line comes over here, then a new guitar line comes over here. And it's just like a lot of stacked melody ideas that come together to create something that feels fairly complex, but equally digestible. All right, let me hit some lyrics on this track. I guess I didn't talk too much about Prologue. It felt like a prologue. It was an introduction of ideas that create anticipation to get into the main idea, really wasn't much there on its own to kind of stand out. It was, I mean, it's 40 seconds of basically a fade in of sounds. So not much to say about that one. Let's hit some lyrics. All right. Now, there are 3 vocalists in here, but they're not quite where I thought they were, or I suppose that is to say that I didn't pick up that there were this many vocalists through a majority of the track. I certainly caught on at the end of the song when we had a vocal stack of 3 on that final repeated phrase, but I didn't really pick up on the 2 vocalists at the beginning until we had the dual parts that I was talking about. What's really interesting is that the song kicks off with the chorus sung by Brendan, then goes into a verse mainly focusing on Casey singing. Then we hit the chorus again with mainly Alex singing. Now also we have Alex, Brendan, and Casey. That's just ABC. I don't know why that cracks me up, but it does. But this is really interesting because I honestly thought most of the first minute and a half, 2 minutes of this track were sung by one person, the lead singer, so to speak. They don't have a lead singer. They trade off parts like crazy. I had mentioned that the first verse and the second chorus have a main singer, but in the first verse, all 3 vocalists take lines. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't hear too much difference in it, at least not anything that immediately grabbed my attention. Maybe if I listen really closely, I'll definitely hear the differences in their cadences or their timbre, the coloring of their voices, but without having known that there were multiple vocalists there, it never dawned on me. It never would have been something I brought up. And so I find that really interesting, just how, I mean, they're all kind of going for the same sort of emo, post-hardcore, clean vocal delivery. So they're all aiming to have a similar-ish sound. And I'm sure the production is similar between all of them. So between the 2 of those, it is kind of covering up any sort of unique colorings that they might have within their vocals. Also, having listened to a lot of the Deer Hunter tracks, as well as an entire album from the Deer Hunter, nothing in here screamed Casey to me. Nothing in this track would have had me immediately saying, oh snap, that sounds like the Deer Hunter vocalist. Some of that may be just how much older this is compared to where I'm used to listening to him. While I have heard some individual tracks from their older works, stuff from this era I've heard very minimal of, and my most recent exposure has been the 2023 album, I think, Anti, which I checked out the entire album of. So it may be that Casey's voice has just changed over the years, and I'm just accustomed to his current coloring and timbre. Regardless, again, I never would have thought that there were 3 vocalists in a single stanza. And that's something I'm going to be listening to on the next track. Hopefully there's sections in there that are written like this one, and I'm not looking for things that aren't there, but I don't want to be duped again. It's kind of wild how I never even picked up on that. Especially when, it's not, I don't know where I was going to go with that. We do have a guest vocalist on this album. Later on in the track, Anthony Green is going to be featured on one of the tracks, and he has a voice that I'm immediately going to recognize, unless he's going to be doing something totally different. But if he's singing the way he normally does, it's just really easy to pick him out. He has a unique sound. And I don't get that with these 3. They're so similar. It's very interesting. As for the lyrics themselves, on the surface, this is about a jailbreak, as the title suggests, planning a prison break. The chorus, which we do hear 4 times, and I think does drag the song down a little bit, says, Warden's calling for a lockdown, baby. He'll call on interim inequities. This is the last night in my body. Assist in the escape. Warden's calling on a jailbreak. He'll fly like only a jailbird could. So we have somebody who is locked up and ready to escape this jail. And there's a warden who anticipates this and calls for a lockdown. The first verse says, like a felon, he fell into scandals, scams and master plans to circumvent all circumstances. He thought to his throat, we can swallow this key and leave when we please. Let's hope this stomach disagrees. So he's going to swallow the key to his cell and eventually throw it up. I assume that's what that final line means. Let's hope the stomach disagrees with this and tries to regurgitate it. And then we'll be able to leave. We'll have snuck the key into the cell itself. The second verse says, make a clean getaway, he said, with his hands outstretched to nurse his neck. She lured him in with a masochistic kiss, and he wished he could be anywhere but here. Not sure what the she is there, or whom the she might be, but this seems to be a continuation. He's nursing his neck after having thrown up a key that can't be, painless. And he wishes he could be anywhere else. Okay. Pretty straightforward continuation of the story here. The bridge. 2 vocals. Arm in arm we walk outside so that all we done was not in vain. He could be anywhere but here. The arm in arm is interesting, given that we already have she elsewhere in here. Arm in arm is, it can be seen a couple of different ways. I mean, one is just solidarity, but to me, arm in arm could also imply a little bit of romance too. So I don't know about that line. That's pretty much it. There is another part to this song though, and I don't know what it means. The end of this track is a repetition of "This is the last night in my body." There's another phrase, "Somehow, for now, this skin will have to do." It's introduced at the back half of the 4th chorus, which is repeated twice, so we technically hear the chorus 5 times on this track. And then it is repeated in after or around or underneath the repetition of "This is the last night in my body," the first few times that is repeated. So is this a literal jailbreak or a figurative one? Is the last night in my body an acceptance that I either get out or die trying, knowing that they're not escaping this place, that the lockdown will successfully stop the jailbreak and they're going to end up being shot and killed while they attempt to leave? Or is this entire jailbreak something else, something within the mind, trying to escape who or what you are to become something else? I don't know, because honestly, the song lyrically just doesn't have enough depth to it. It really wants to be something more. I can feel it. There's just not a lot here, especially when the chorus, which already has a bit of repetition in it within itself, is only 4 lines long and takes up over half of this track. Another quarter is taken up by the end, "This is the last night in my body," and that leaves a very small amount of this track for the bridge, which is basically one new sentence and one old sentence, and the 2 verses, which are 11 lines combined. There's just not enough here to tell this story. I keep coming back to the idea that maybe the repetition is the purpose of it. Maybe I should be reading more into why we hear the chorus as often as we do. But I just don't get anything in it that is beneficial to hear as many times as we do. And I wish that being 5 minutes of music, they took a little bit more of that time to flesh out the narrative they're trying to tell rather than to get back to the hook again, which it feels like often that's what it's doing. Let's finish up this verse and get back to that catchy chorus part. And the chorus is catchy. I already said that about it in the analysis segment. I like the chorus of this song. Not enough to hear it as many times as they did, but it's a good chorus. But it is taking time away while not saying anything much at all, other than saying we're escaping, which, cool, but why? From where? Is this a metaphor? I get fragments of ideas, and unfortunately, that's about it. This next one's called Rivalry Code. Wait, Rivalry Code. One second. All right, honestly, I have no idea where I got Rivalry Code from. It is the rival cycle. All right, let's kick it, see what's going on here. Okay, so a direct continuation from the previous track. There is a lot going on here. That previous verse reminded me a lot of The Used in their sophomore album, which was a year prior to this, so probably written around the same time. Another noise ending? I'm a little perturbed. Not anything to do with the track. The one time I really need an album to flow, and I have it on a platform that doesn't allow for crossfade between tracks because they're all different videos. I would love to hear this just consistent. It sounds like every track's going to end up flowing into the next. So, yeah, we've listened to so many songs, or so many albums recently where the songs don't flow into one another, and they could have worked not having been on a proper streaming service. Anyways, this track is interesting. There are several parts of it that reminds me of emo as it was becoming pop emo, as alternative rock was beginning to be tossed a little bit into that older emo sound. Many parts of this track feel like The Used around the same time when they released their In Love and Death album a year before this one was released. Being that they're so close, I don't think either of them necessarily were influenced by the other. It might have just been a case of two bands developing a similar sound simultaneously. But I do love a lot of the way this sounds because it basically feels like new The Used music from an era I'm really fond of that the band really hasn't revisited much since that time. I really enjoy those moments. I think it's interesting too to bring in a more punky sound to contrast it. When the vocals aren't singing, it's a clear post-hardcore idea with the clear focus on moving guitar riffs that have a bit of edginess and darkness in it. It's very cool to see the song kind of bounce between these two modes of kind of a flat composition where the guitars are chordal bass. The bass is mostly pedal tone. There's a little bit of movement to it. The drums are a bit reserved as well because there's so much vocal work going on. But as soon as the vocals leave, it carves out so much space. And so we need to do more things with that. And usually the guitars take over as the new lead instrument. And this focus change in, what instruments are playing what roles ends up bringing a compositional change as well, a little bit of a genre shift in these moments. So I really enjoy that back and forth. I don't think it always quite works, but we kind of move from a darkness into a chaos. And I do think that the vocal parts are chaotic. I don't know if it's the production. I don't know if it's just how close these timbres fit. And I'll tell you, I didn't hear any difference between these vocalists. So I don't know what's going on. Either my ears are wonky today, or these are clones. These guys have cloned their vocal cords and put them into each other. And they're all singing different parts, but sounding so close. It's wild. But their vocals are really close, and that muddies things up too. You don't have texture differences to help differentiate or create space between the different melody lines. So that kind of melds too. I mean, think about like a trumpet and a flute, or maybe even a trumpet and clarinet really get that vibrating wood sound in there. Even if they're playing within the same range of pitches, you're still going to clearly be able to hear the difference between the two. But if you have two trumpets or two clarinets playing two distinct sounds, they're going to start to meld together. You don't really know which clarinet is playing which part, and the dual melodies can kind of start to feel like a single idea. Might be incredibly complex, but it's going to be tougher to pick them apart and to isolate the melodies themselves. And so when these vocals are so close together, they start melding together. And it's not just the melodies that are getting melded, it's also words and syllables. And it just becomes difficult to listen to musically or lyrically. There's just a lot going on. But I also think the production plays into this a little bit too. There is quite a bit of spaciousness in this, which I appreciate, but you really need to carve out space between all of these different stems in order to give them separation within the song itself. And so the vocals are mixing, the production isn't helping, and it just creates something that feels very cluttered. Now, I have to admit, I have some nostalgia for this. I love a lot of similar music from this era, and not all of it has a pop level of production, especially not a 2020s pop level of production. Things were just grittier in the 90s and the turn of the century. And this kind of follows a lot of the sounds I would expect of the time. And I do enjoy the sound of it, like from a purely casual element. But I do think that I wish it was a little cleaner. Maybe if there was a remastering of this, that just helped differentiate the voices a little bit, create some spaciousness between them, and really allow them to thrive individually rather than become this conglomeration of sounds. Although, from a thematic perspective, if we are looking at people arguing, maybe literal people arguing, maybe arguments within your head, this sort of conglomeration of sound works really well at, creating a theme, a narrative. So there are certainly ways to use this positively. But coming at it from a purely musical standpoint, it gets muddy, it gets chaotic. And sometimes it's fun, but more often than not, I just found myself wishing it was done a little bit better, especially knowing where Casey would end up going and the sort of clarity and production perfection that he would chase in his later works. So that might be playing a little bit into it as well. This is a bit more straightforward track, though. A lot of this is just very foundational music with complicated melodic, what's the word I want? Counterpoint on top of it, with all the vocals doing their things. And when there's only one vocalist, there's usually a guitar that's playing alongside it too. So there's always some sort of dual melody element happening, but it isn't quite as dense as the previous track. And it tends to be a bit more straightforward, particularly within both the composition but also the structure of it. Yeah, let's hit some lyrics on this one. All right. This track is rather interesting because there's only one vocalist. I just can't catch a break on this. I really can't. At least in this case, though, when everything sounds similar, that's the reason right there. Because it's all one person. Lyrically, though, I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. The first stanza implies people coming together who aren't necessarily healthy. It says, alongside all hearts as they finish with backdrop cities, and as jagged teeth digging deeper, ripping new wounds for former scars, sickened lungs insist on heavy breathing. It then says, the conductor is conducting electrical time signatures and I fall into rhythm. My life is a rhythm and my feet will improvise. My feet are off beat as I sputter at the knee like a leaking faucet. What? To be out of sync with yourself, I suppose, is what that's trying to say. His entire life is a rhythm. Maybe he's talking about a repetition in life. Every day is the same, but he never feels locked into that. And then jumps to, you'll be undercover under covers, sleeping with the enemy. This is what we like to call internal espionage. While this is being sung, the other vocal line says, concrete coated gazes in hot pursuit of mouth-made mazes, talking circles around each other, deserting halos to be, handcuffed and hogtied with your words. So we have some sort of joining together, a relationship of sorts, but it's not necessarily predicated on strength or unity. It seems that both of them are dancing around what they really want. It says that they talk circles around each other, hogtied by their own words. The next one is probably one of the more chaotic single vocal sections. This had a really interesting drum part to it, and we shifted to an 11-beat phrase. I'm going to assume that this was probably bouncing between 5/4 and 6/4, but it's quite possible it's also written in 11/4. That would just be a really long bar to have to read. That's usually not fun. But since there's probably no sheet music at play here, we could just easily call it an 11/4 bar. It says, on the search for girls, stricken with insomnia, with milk carton father figures, my veins are pulsing, freeform jazz to peninsula extremities, my fingers to tap polyrhythms like nervous fragments from a nervous mouth, and these words set the cadence to the crude interpretation of scripts and codes, breeding pixels without homes, reside in my mind, resonates in my eyes. Yeah. So we see more music metaphor being used here. We had the idea of the conductor and the time signatures and rhythm and improvisation in the first verse. Here we have freeform jazz, we have polyrhythms, and it basically says that all of this is odd and out of place. Nothing feels fluid through all of this. That life, or at least the situation, becomes like freeform jazz. It then says, to leave the injured overturned and fight for breath with flailing arms, in vain to float the bane. And aside from wasting energy as a general theme here, I don't quite understand this. It's the penultimate idea, though. It is repeated again after an instrumental bridge, and then we return back to the chorus of being undercover, undercovers. So we have two people who are doing something together, but it's not necessarily what they want to do, and they refuse to actually state what they want out of their life, possibly from the other, maybe also, and that there's a heavy use of rhythmic metaphor in here where our narrator both feels out of rhythm in their own life, but out of rhythm when they're with this other person as well. There's just not a there's not a connection there. I would normally leave it there, but Casey has actually gone on record during an interview stating that this song is about empty sex. It was written with Brandon, who, from his perspective, wrote it about masturbation, but it's pretty much that idea in general. He mentions, and I quote, "It's the isolation, the embarrassment, resentment, and regret that can be negative side effects of these events." I don't really get that in this track. I think once again, I can see where the complexity is kind of getting in the way of things. This is written exceptionally poetically. There's so many really cool lines in here. There's some rhythmic devices that work really well. The use of the musical motif throughout the lyrics, and even the words themselves, the alliteration and the expanded vocabulary. I think there's some really cool ideas going on in here, but it ultimately ends up tripping over its own shoes because it's decided to make a pair of shoes with 10 laces each. It looks cool, but that's just a lot of room for error to come about. And I think that's what's happening here. It's just tripping over its own complexity. It wants to say something, and it kind of got there. I got the idea of two people not really being on the same wavelengths with each other, and somebody not being too happy within their own life either, but nothing of what they said that they wrote the song to be about comes through, to me at least. I don't know. I mean, we still have a lot of music ahead of us, but, we're now 2 songs into this, and that's been a recurring idea. Why? What? Okay, yeah. Of course, I've been using this interface. Why would I put the YouTube one on? Okay, anyways, that's been a recurring idea so far, is that it's ambitious, but they're biting off more than they can chew, and it's just not always well done. But I can see the ambition, and I had nothing but praise for their follow-up album. So it may have just been that they needed a bit of time to mature and grow with their writing style and really hone that down. Although, if I remember correctly, Casey wasn't a part of that one either. And maybe that had something to do with it too. I don't know. I don't know if there was like drama within the band or anything like that could have caused this, but there's certainly a schism between what I think the intentions are and what the execution ends up being. We have a lot of album to go though, so I'm sure that opinion can change. Let's dive into this next track then, The Evidence.
It's the consequence of privileged information. You can run, you can hide, but light will find a way and wither away. Haunted and haunting, we all are followed by shadows from martyrs and mercenaries, diseased by information, plagued by what we know. But the evidence is enough to make a case. It's enough to incriminate.
These are 2 different vocalists. They're so close though. Oh, the delay on that.
Down the empty corridor to the coroner. It's haunted and haunting. We are followed like shadows, like by what we know. The evidence is enough to make a case. It's enough
think this will be the last time we do an analysis of a single song. A lot of things are really coalescing into a single idea here, and I am beginning to repeat myself quite a bit. Dude, I'm glad to have all the vocal layers again. It is a joy to listen to, and I had the lyrics pulled up for this one, and yeah, dude, all three of these vocalists sound identical to me. I really can't tell the difference between them. I thought for a second that Casey was the only one who ever incorporated a little bit of rasp, as we heard a couple of times, adding that little bit of bite into the line. But no, no, someone else brought that in. What was it? I think it was Brendan during the chorus introduced a little bit of it too. No one's gotten into a full-on fry scream yet, but we do have a little bit of extra energy that comes through, a little bit of natural compression put on the vocals at times, and it gives the song a lot of energy in those sections. I do enjoy the way that these songs are built. They're all done on a blueprint, I would say. All of these tracks so far have focused on two main ideas. Either there's a minimal amount of vocal work so we can maximize our instrumentation. This is where we will have the bass and the guitars, both guitars and the drums, all doing something interesting and possibly even an electronic part in the background as well. All of them doing their own concepts, layering up unique individual ideas. And the vocals will sit on top of that. Occasionally, we will also have a guitar doing counterpoint against the vocal melody too. So that's pretty cool. There's very few sections in here where we have exclusively just a single melody. The other side of this equation is that the complexity comes from the vocals at times, and then the instrumentation really mellows out. This is like what we saw on the last track with the breakdown section, where all the instruments, the second track with the breakdown section, where the instruments just kind of flatten out, do one thing altogether, create something uniform, and this is a platform for all the vocal stuff to sit on top of. This is not what always happens. In fact, with the end of this track, we did have a melodic guitar line alongside 3 vocal lines. That was a lot. I will say though that I think that guitar with vocals tends to stand out a little bit more, given that the guitar timbre is quite a bit different from the vocals. Despite being in similar ranges, I can make them out a little bit more. Also, having the placement off to the side helps as well. The other aspect that really stands out to me is kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, I'm very familiar with post-hardcore music and emo music, and this just, it feels like that. There's sometimes some more progressive elements. Track 2's linear structure. The previous track's 11-beat phrase. There are some places where things kind of, where they try to push the boundaries on what the genre is by being a bit more progressive. But generally speaking, when I think about the emotion, when I think of the narrative of these songs, nothing really stands out to me. And I think that's just because, much like how metal just always feels aggressive to me, this just feels, I don't know, nostalgic. I don't really get too much of an emotion out of it. It's just the sound for this style of music. And I would not blame anybody who has listened to these 3 tracks so far and thought, well, I mean, they all kind of just sound like the same thing. I kind of feel the same way about a lot of black metal, and if you really love that genre and listen to it a lot, I'm sure you hear more of the nuances to it. But there is a lot of similarities between these 3 tracks so far, their emotion, their atmosphere, and their general sound. And so I don't know that I'm going to have a lot to add on to this. It's really interesting where the genre I'm most familiar with, I kind of have the least amount of things to say. And I'm trying to, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm so familiar with it. I'm overlooking some elements to it that seems backwards to me, but it's possible. But these songs just sound normal. They don't sound sad or aggressive or haunting or eerie or happy or joyful or any of it. They just sound like they are. I don't get any emotion out of it. It's really wild. It kind of makes me want to dive into the harmonic theory behind this sound, this very generic emo post-hardcore mix, and kind of boil down what kind of chord progressions we're looking at, and in a more traditional sense, what those chord progressions might be alluding to outside of this sound. And kind of see if that helps me understand it anymore. Maybe there is just a general neutrality to it. Even the metal that I'm more familiar with, particularly like a 90s, I don't know, like a thrash metal. I mean, I grew up on early Metallica. That's what my parents always played in the car. And like, I have a lot of experience with that era of metal, and it still sounds angsty to me. That's just always been a feeling of it. So maybe familiarity's not the I'm curious, what does everyone else feel out of this track? Or these tracks that we've listened to so far? Still though, I'm enjoying the bass work. Hearing the bass do things is always a pleasure. Multiple vocal lines, excellent. The guitars shifting from lower end weighty stuff to higher end twinkling emo stuff. Absolutely love that. And the drum work is consistently surprising, always tossing new ideas into the fray. So, I mean, I really enjoy all of this. I just don't have a lot of analysis for it, I suppose. Let's hit some lyrics. Before we get into the lyrics of this track, I do want to focus on a theme that I'm hearing within the lyrics, which is words that sound similar but aren't. This track, we see the phrase haunted and haunting. We also see the phrase down the empty corridor to the coroner. So we have corridor and coroner there. We also saw this in previous tracks, though. The rival cycle had the lyrics conductor is conducting. We also had you'll be undercover, undercovers. I think there was another one in there. Oh, so affect this love affliction, affect and affliction. Kind of similar. Track 1, the prison break. What did we have? The first one, yeah. The first verse had a lot of this. We had like a felon, he fell into scandals. We also had circumvent all circumstances. So this is the masochistic kiss. This is something that continues to pop up, and sometimes I think it is clever, and other times I feel like it's forced. I think it is one of those cases where aiming for complexity is harming the overall digestibility and fluidity of everything. It's trying to seem smarter than it needs to in order to get its message across. And like, I don't know, sometimes it's cool, but it's not, it just turns into a pattern eventually, and I start looking for it. When's the next one going to be? What are they going to do next? And at that point, it stops feeling natural. It starts feeling a bit more forced. Looking at the lyrics for this one, though, there's a lot of repetition in here. The little bit of unique lines we get seem to point towards the dangers of having information that people want erased and living dangerously because of that. The first verse says it's the consequence of privileged information. You can run, you can hide, but light will find a way. I think this is interesting because right from the start, it seems to be evoking the concept of truth. You can run, you can try to hide, but I have the information. Light will find a way. This will eventually come out. The rest of the track, though, seems to turn that, though. Calls it a disease of information, that we are plagued by what we know. It says you've got what they want and they will find you. Haunted and haunting, we are followed by shadows. It says burn the evidence. It's enough to make a case and it's enough to incriminate. The entire bridge is a repetition of the phrase, it's just a matter of time before they find out. And then that ends with her fingers, like spiders, spun a web my body couldn't shed, about finally being trapped. This is a song about knowing something that somebody doesn't want out there, and eventually getting caught and being destroyed. The evidence itself, burn the evidence. It's enough to make a case, as the chorus states, but the evidence is knowledge. I assume that the person with this knowledge is also being disposed of alongside with it. But that's it. Like, it doesn't tell a story. It has a theme that it explores a couple of facets of, but never really does anything of interest. It just says, if you have knowledge, that can be dangerous. People will chase you. And why do I need 4 whole minutes of that? There's just a lot of repeated information in the lyrics. I really wish that as many lines as these tracks have, there was less repeated ideas and we actually fleshed some stuff out. The next track is called The War of All, Against All. Let's kick it. Did it again. So a little eruption of freedom out of that heavy weight. Little rough there. The vocal production on this one is a little undercooked too. Was this recorded and produced earlier than the rest of the tracks? The lower energy here. Yeah. So we have the contrast between the verse and choruses. There's still 2 minutes left in the track. So much like track 2, it's just a really odd ending. Beautiful within its own right, but totally out of place with the track itself.
This is what we like to call.
I think parts of those words are from another track, though. This is what we like to call, what is it, espionage? Internal espionage. Yeah, that was from the Rival cycle. Classic. The backmasked section is interesting. It does just make it muddy though, but I think it could be done well.
Self
this song is playing a little bit more with contrast, tension and release. Interesting track. Well, I should say interesting finale. I certainly find that one to be a bit more dynamic than their others, simply because they are consistently moving away from lower energy sections to higher energy sections. And we see this contrast throughout that entire track up until the ending, where we just kind of focus on a lower energy one. But I will say the vocals, once again, I'm torn about it. I really love the dual and triple vocal lines, but it is muddy. It's really tough to understand any of them from either a musical or a lyrical perspective. I am curious about the endings, though. This is the third track, at least within the first 6 here, where the ending is gorgeous in its own right, but just not really tied into anything at large. Maybe the lyrics might shine light on it, but in the past, the lyrics have not really alluded to why we end up in these softer, gorgeous, layered finales. Or even in the cases where the ending tends to be more noisy, just kind of a sound, a crescendo into the next track. Why do the songs end these ways? And what's the purpose of tying this all together musically? Was it simply, again, trying to be ambitious? We're going to make 70 minutes of music, no gaps. Or is there a purpose to all of it? I haven't really seen too many lyrical themes that we can tie any of these tracks together on. So I don't think that there's some larger idea they're trying to convey or message they're trying to convey on this album. It simply just seems to be that they've written a bunch of these 3 to 4 minute tracks, and then they'll write a 30 to 40 second, sometimes even minute long endings to them that go into the next song. But why are they connected? Why are they there? I really think that this album ended up being incredibly ambitious. Not always to its benefit, but I have to give credit where credit's due. They took a massive bite of this sandwich and, well, they're chewing their way through it. And they're not giving up. And I give them credit for that. But ultimately, I think that there is a really solid, maybe less experimental idea in this album. You just trim off the fat. You might bring it down to like 55 minutes rather than 60, and that's just cutting off the transition sections, which I really don't think are adding much to the track. But even with a track like number 2, we listen to the chorus 5 times. Do we need that? There's probably a really cohesive, slimmer 40 to 50 minute album in here, and I think they just didn't want that. And so they tried to do more stuff, and it's hit and miss. There's some really cool ideas in here that no one else was doing, but there's also a lot of stuff in here that just isn't quite working, but no one else was doing them. So that's kind of cool too. This track in particularly did remind me a little bit more of Coheed and Cambria, which I think that if I'm going to compare some of their albums, though, I think the ones I'm comparing them to are later than this. So it might not be entirely fair. I think Coheed does the progressive post-hardcore thing a little bit better. But again, I think I'm comparing some stuff where they might have had more experience writing. Because even Coheed, I think Coheed's first album was quite a bit before this one. So, I mean, it could also be, now that I'm thinking about this, maybe Receiving End of Sirens listened to a lot of Coheed and they're like, yeah, we want to do stuff like that. And this was their first shot at it. Although Coheed doesn't do the multiple layered vocals like these guys do. So again, it's kind of tough to say that any one band really influenced another in this area of, mixing post-hardcore with pop and alternative rock and emo and kind of bringing it all together. A lot of bands are doing it in their own ways. Receiving End of Sirens is certainly doing their own thing here. And I do generally like this. But I don't know if I'm going to come back to it. Not unless they make a remastered version. I would absolutely love something with some cleaner production on this. But it's just a little too rough around the edges, which is interesting. Usually I enjoy music that's a little rougher. I mean, I like super clean stuff too. Y'all know me. I love my pop music. Super crisp production, I'm there for it. But I grew up around this sound. A lot of the stuff I listened to when I was younger had rougher production values to it. I should like this. And I do, just not enough to want to spin it again immediately. I'm not getting that feel where, I'm halfway through the album and I'm like, dude, as soon as this video is over, I'm putting this back on. I'm listening to it again tonight. It's every time I have a moment, it's going to be on. That's just not where I'm at with it, which is a bit of a shame because on paper, it's a lot of what I love. Let me hit some lyrics on these two. The war of all against all is a song about war. It's just kind of vague in what it is. It talks about hearses and white flags, foxholes and trenches, casualties. And it says that we are the core of corpses, going along with that idea that there's lots of these phonetic similarities in here. It says, then we are up in arms and armed. That's the chorus right there. The core of corpses, up in arms and armed. The second verse just says that we will continue doing this. Push on, plod on, these legs like piston pumping forward motion. Now we hit the chorus again. The finale, the ending stanza says, the cannon is calling our name and I hear her singing to me. In Morse code, this is our revolution to arms. This is a song about fighting. I suppose with a track called The War of All Against All, yeah, there's no line to separate who anyone is. It's just battle for battle's sake. There is one stanza, though, that kind of eludes me. It says, we were led to lead lovers while marching to the beat. We were led to lead lovers we kissed so well. I have no idea, other than the obvious alliteration and phonetic similarities of led, lead, lovers. I don't really understand what's going on there. I do want to point to the first verse, though, which I think does a fantastic job of bringing in that poetic writing while, I don't know, just being really interesting. There's some cool interline rhyming in here and some alliteration alongside the phonetic similarities, and it's just a really fun thing to read. It says that some are so well rehearsed. For hearses, it hurts, always the first to wave the white flag, and barricade themselves in false pretenses, foxholed in trenches, forged casualties with casual pleas, dying to please the enemy. It just sounds really cool. And I think it works in this case because it isn't just a one-off similarity that we've seen in other places where it kind of stands out like a sore thumb, but this is a part of several other connected linguistic elements that elevates this entire stanza. It makes sense if you just read it through and take it at face value, but it's also full of so many cool literary devices. And I mean, it sounds great also because of all of the recurring consonant sounds in there. Sorry, vowel sounds, but also the consonant sounds too, with the reoccurring F's and W's and H's that show up all throughout this. So it's just a really good element. And I think that, you know, I've kind of talked about how some of the lyrics haven't been as strong while still trying to be interesting. I think this is a case where their execution met their ambition. And while that isn't something that I would say is consistent on the album, it certainly does show up here. Then I Defy You, Stars, is a track about changing who you are, your identity, through the lens of Romeo and Juliet, who needed to shed off their familiar elements. I don't know. I feel like there's a really big stretch going on here. We have, I don't know, it's like the fourth stanza. There's no verses or choruses in this that I could tell. It says, "Where art thou? I've dressed up this canvas skin, painted something colorful. Self-inflicted surgery is now routine. It erases all traces of faces." But the idea of removing something. Earlier, we see a rearrange the cells that form my skin, see them through kaleidoscope eyes, because everybody feigns sometimes, being someone that you're not, doing so through distorted vision. The very first stanza says, "The apparitions tango to the sound of their heels tapping, a procession of prosthetic limbs and mannequins. They're all perfect models of imperfection with marrow made of cellophane." It talks about how they look on the outside as if they're perfect, but inside they're not, or just beneath the surface they aren't, and that even if you go down to the marrow of the bone, you will find that it is synthetic. That everything about this person has been changed to meet some sort of other expectation. This concept of cosmetic surgery or cosmetic change, an alteration to the appearance, is rather consistent through here. We have the cellophane in the marrow. We have rearranging the cells that form my skin. Even straight says self-inflicted surgery is now routine. So we have all these ideas of, you know, adjusting who you visually are. To bring in the Romeo and Juliet part, the second stanza says, "Strap on your ballroom best, breathe in and don't exhale. Oh, Juliet, deny your name, your father, deny who you are." The fourth stanza says, "Blur your eyes and bend the lines. Do you like what you see, oh Romeo?" So to look around what is actually in front of you, to blur your eyes, to distort your vision, and to bend the lines to see around the truth. That's every line in here. So we have this consistent setup of distorting reality and shedding off who you were to become someone new through this not always perfect parallel drawn between Romeo and Juliet, who were both trying to shed their family, shed their identity and their name so that they could be together, and cosmetic surgery. It's, again, I can see the idea here. I don't think the execution is incredibly solid, but I can at least appreciate what they were going for. There is plenty of "Where art thou now, Romeo" thrown in here too, just for good measures, to have some of that Shakespearean element in it. But it just feels a little weak, and I really have to squint my eyes to see what they're doing and to kind of, get what they're aiming for. All right. Next up, we have the track Intermission, which is 4.5 minutes long, so I'm expecting a full track out of this, but it is titled Intermission. Let's see where they take us here. Another use of, maybe not, I think it is backwards playing, but also, I mean, it's inverse velocity. Yeah, I don't think it's backwards. I think it's inverse velocity, where the loudest part is at the end rather than the beginning. Cool bass line. We also have some digital drums alongside the acoustic drum kit. It's very light and floaty, which is kind of cool. Very light vocal work in the backgrounds. Big drums out to the sides. Also, is that heavily compressed tremolo picking in the back? Ooh. Lots of wild stuff happening over there. Interesting shift between 3 and 4 across this track. after all of that heavy noise, we kind of find a midpoint. We still have this aggressive sounding guitar, but it's supported by these uplifting sounds. Sort of a light and breezy indie rock vibe. Atmospherically, it's dense, but harmonically, it's light.
The gross fabrication of pretext could pour. Yet still I fall victim from syntax.
I love that back and forth.
Just shy of something I could understand. So pistol I press on to the sound of the organs, playing the most convincing tunes as they serenade to the parade of paid off parts. Now the only thing left to discuss is the details of this armistice. We've come to this agreement.
Oh, then go for the fourth one. The gorgeous chorus here.
Forsaken by my limbs sing the hymns of the tyrant in a crumbling pantheon. As inhabitants will raise their fists and bid him to disarm. Struck by battle, the truth is vital to this cause. I've been outlasted, a captive of this casting shell. Give me gravity, give me clarity, give me something to rely
So both guitars going crazy, and 3 vocals, 2 cleans, and a harsh.
Now the only thing left to discuss is the details of this armistice.
Marching snare, almost. You can hit it this time? Yeah. Oh! Went for the fifth.
Between the heart and the synapse. Oh, how I've been to fade in light of
Thought there was some vocals tucked underneath. So another dual ending transition. That one is a little bit less transition-y. It feels like the decay of that final note is going to continue on into the next track, but it's not a continuation of an idea. There's actually a solid ending at the end of that track. Very interesting. Yeah, this is another track that I expect from them. It does a lot of the stuff I've been talking about, but I don't know if it's because of Intermission, but I'm starting to see something really interesting here. Intermission was a track that did two things: gorgeous and beautiful layered writing, and then dense and chaotic layered writing. The first half, or I should say the first third of it, is gorgeous. This is a term I've used to describe a lot of intros and outros on this album. This track, no different. It starts off incredibly well done, harmonically, consonant, balanced, just incredibly uplifting. It is bright, it is empowering, it is light. I think that's the thing about it. There's so many moving parts, and yet it still feels like it's lacking in gravity. The other side of this equation is a lot of moving parts, but not really working well together to achieve this uplifting element. It's more of a weight. This is what we got in the middle of the track. Here, through the lens of gnarly guitars and distorted sounds and some sort of quasi shoegaze texture in the background of the that section as well. It is still wildly layered. It still works. Every element is working together to create something. It's just not something focusing on uplift, on positive. It's more of a negative working together, sort of like how post-metal works together to create a crushing wall of sound. This is kind of doing that same thing, but pushing into the realms of noise rock. I don't think it ever hits those areas. I think harmonically it still is focusing more on consonant sounds, and anytime there is dissonance, it is a light element of dissonance in order to create tension for resolution. But it is still incredibly tense, layered wise of everything that's happening. It's difficult to pay attention to every single element. This duality stands out to me on Intermission, and as we got into the end of the track and we lightened things up again, I realized just how easily this element of rising and falling cohesion might be a way to describe it. Again, when we get to the what I would describe as less cohesive sections, they are cohesively working together to create something anxious and tense and dense. So it's not to say that they're falling apart. It's just not designed to create something beautiful and uplifting. It's designed to create a flavor of chaos, of too many things happening at once. This is something I've described this entire album as having to be a problem with it. And I don't know if I'm coming around to seeing it from the other perspective. I still think that these moments tend to be downers for me. Something that I wish was executed better, but I can see the intention of. But you can map this to a lot of this album. I do feel like this is an album of duality. Just looking at the Armistice, this track moved between these beautiful, gorgeous moments. Single vocals, sometimes a second vocal for augmenting specific syllables or phrases. Beautiful guitars just dancing on the outside. It's very bright and vibrant. A piano that keeps everything light as well. Drum work that is pushing the song forward without feeling overbearing. These sections tend to grow into the explosive choruses, bridges, and outros that have 3 vocal lines, and as we saw in the penultimate section, 3 vocal lines and 2 moving guitars that were, again, kind of veering into noise rock territory, just constant 8th note moving on both of them, not synergized in any way, just kind of 2 moving parts alongside this densely layered vocal stuff. We have 5 melodies here. It's chaotic. Musically, I do hear uplift. The piano in this moment is still trying to push for that. The chords from the bass line are trying to push in that direction, but it ends up just kind of feeling like 5 parts clashing in the middle of the song, disrupting that harmonious sound that the few instruments left that are working together are trying to support. And this clashing ends up feeling like a core motif of this album. The beauty versus the controlled chaos. Beauty might even be the wrong word for it, because the end of this track I do feel is trying to be uplifting. If you listen to the individual vocal parts, you'll find most of them are pushing towards a positive, energetic, driven vibe. There's just too many of those messages coming through at the same time that creates a cluttered mess. So again, beauty, these sections aren't lacking beauty, there's just too much conflicting beauty, which is creating gnarliness. It's really interesting when I start to break this down and really listen to as much as I can take it at one time, because these are incredibly dense moments of these songs. But I think that really is what it's about. We have these focused beauty sections and then the chaotic beauty sections, which kind of subvert themselves due to the chaos. And this album jumps back and forth between these 2 extremes frequently. That's what most of these songs do. They're focused, and then they're chaotically layered, and then they're focusedly layered, and then chaotically layered. And I think Intermission, taking out the vocal parts and just focusing on this compositional structure, this blueprint, allowed me to see past the distraction of the vocal cacophony and start to see the pattern on a more blatant level, more easily digestible. And applying that to this Armistice and then retroactively to the rest of the songs and what I remember about them, this is how this album operates. It's a really interesting revelation here, and I wonder if this contrast is something they've been trying to explore. The lyrics don't stick with me as much as the music does. That's probably simply down to the fact that I spend a lot of the time listening to the music, and then when the song is over, later on, I will look at the words divorced from the music. So that's something that would be corrected on subsequent listens as I begin to focus more on lyrics and then kind of hear them all together after I'm more familiar with the tracks. That's just the way I listen to music, even casually. But I do wonder if some of the lyrics in the past have been about this as well. The strife between focused advancement and chaotic advancements, of having multiple viewpoints, all maybe wanting the same end goal, but having different ideas of getting there and ending up stepping over each other's toes because no one's plans are synergistic with one another. I do know that there has been elements of conflict within the lyrics. The war of all against all was easily about conflict. Evidence was about conflict too. Someone who knew things and someone who wanted them to stop knowing those things, in a sense. Prison Break, the warden versus the prisoner. So there's definitely this element of one against another in a few of these tracks. But I don't know if it's something I would consider a strong lyrical theme, at least not at this point. Let's dive into some lyrics for these two tracks and we'll see what's going on there. Not really sure what to make of Intermission's lyrics. It says, "We have tested the buoyancy of loyalty." There's another one of those soft rhymes. "You left our lungs for canteens. You left our ankles for anchors." That one I feel is not a good one. I feel like they've lost literal meaning in search for the rhyme itself. What does it mean to leave our ankles for anchors? At least leaving our lungs for canteens, I can kind of see that. Out for your own benefit at the cause of having everyone else drown, especially as we continue this the ship sea kind of analogy, already talking about the buoyancy of loyalty. It says, "You had your arms tied behind your back, but elastic bands tied your hands." Why is there a but there? That doesn't change it. The arms were tied behind your back and the hands were tied with elastic bands makes more sense. It adds to the understanding of it. We already knew that their arms, well, it says their arms were tied, but also their hands. Like, I don't know. And then it says, "You swim with reckless abandoned ship." And abandon is used as a transitory word there because we have swimming with reckless abandon and then the command of abandoned ship. So that one I feel is kind of clever. But that's it. So we have someone, it's just saying that you only think for yourself and you'll leave a wake of those behind you because you don't care about anyone else's benefit, only your own, and you'll always put yourself above others. And then using this ship analogy along with it, I mean, it's okay. The music didn't feel very watery or shippy either, but I suppose none of the music really has on the album. This is definitely post-hardcore with some emo dipped in there and some more progressive structure. And then lyrics put to that. Haven't really seen too much synergy there, but I don't know. These lyrics, they get the point across. They just feel not quite well done, maybe. I don't know, dude. It's just, sometimes I look at the lyrics, I'm like, dude, this is clever. I'm really enjoying this. The metaphor works, the literary elements work. It's just really well done. And other times I'll be like, dude, I feel like the words are getting in the way of the meaning. Does that make sense? Like they're trying to be more clever than they have the chops for. I suppose it's easier to tell in music when you can tell that a band was more ambitious than their skill, where you can tell that the ideas are there, they're just having a tough time pulling it off. Maybe there's some rough performance elements, maybe it's just a little choppier, or there's a couple of flubs in there, and you're like, dang, They almost had that, they almost pulled it off, but they just couldn't. Or you can tell that maybe the idea was larger, but they had to simplify it a little bit to fit their skill. And I think it's really easy to tell in music when you hear a musician trying to play something that's a little bit outside of their skill, but they really wanted to do it. They didn't want to compromise on their vision. In language, it's a little tougher to see that. But I think that's what's happening in this track in particular. The idea right here is solid. I can see the idea. I can see what they're aiming for. It just doesn't quite come together well. But maybe that's also intentional. The music here is chaotic and noisy, and the vocal delivery, if I remember correctly, is ups and downs. There's high points, lots of volume, lots of projection, and low points, just kind of quiet. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense in the music either. I don't know, what do y'all think about this one? Does it make sense to you? Is it a really strongly written song, or are you also in the same boat as me where their need to sound clever or more interesting is kind of getting in the way of being good or interesting? Good's not a great word for that. That's too subjective, but I don't know. It's a little off to me for some reason. I don't know if I've quite put it into words why. Interestingly, this Armistice is about a disconnect. I don't think that was the word I particularly used when I was talking about the conflict and the friction between the more focused, beautiful sections and the sections that wanted to be focused but were more conflicting because of all the layers that were going on that kind of create a chaotic element to it. But this song carries the album title. It says, "You've caused this collapse between the heart and the synapse." There's two things, what I want to do in my heart and what my brain is doing. And there's a collapse between the two. They're no longer working in tandem. There is this friction between the two. As I mentioned, that a lot of these tracks have had conflict. This one is a conflict within. Now, this conflict has been created through manipulation. The opening stanza says, "Your gross fabrication of pretense could bore, yet still I fall victim to syntax omitted, just shy of something I could understand. So blissful I press on to the sound of the organs playing their most convincing tunes as they serenade to the parade of paid-off parts." First of all, I want to give credit to that. To jump from serenade to parade through rhyme and then starting the P for the alliteration of parade of paid-off parts, well done. As much as I, have kind of bashed some of the literary elements that I just that I'm not as fond of, that I find are a bit disruptive to the lyrics, I gotta point out when they're done well, and I thought that worked really good. Really good. There's my grammar for you. That worked really well. But the idea here says that I fall victim to syntax omitted. So I miss the things that aren't said, and I fall under the sway of the command because of what is said. That there is elements that, if I really thought about this, yeah, dude, this doesn't make any sense, but there's something charismatic about the speaker, and, well, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to go along with them. Says that the sound of the organs play their most convincing tunes, and so blissfully I press on. I just go along with everything. That's where the post-chorus really kicks in. Says, "We are all puppets, we are all marionettes, but tell me who's pulling the strings and tell me who it is that you move for." This idea that someone above is puppeting us through vernacular, through speech, through music, ways of manipulating how we think, what we think, through everything as simple as speech, as simple as what isn't said, or even the music that they play when they say something. It's a lot of ways to emotionally and mentally manipulate someone into doing something that they might not otherwise want to do. That's the idea of the breakdown between the heart and the synapse. Verse 2. "These body parts are parts of plans passed by my hands shake through handshakes. Forsaken by my limbs sing the hymns of a tyrant in a crumbling pantheon, and inhabitants will raise their fists and bid him to disarm." Not the smoothest movement, but the use of repetition in here to take an idea, take the last syllable of the idea to kick off the next idea itself. It is kind of interesting. I think it sounded better in the song, as there are 3 different vocals here. We have Casey, Alex, and then sometimes they both come together to harmonize on certain lines. It does bounce around better sonically in the music, but it's it's a little rough when you just say it out loud. I think it's one of those things where musically it works better than poetically. But the idea here is that what I do with my hands is all done through someone else. They're parts of someone else's plans, that my limbs are forsaken by singing the hymns of a tyrant. Someone who wishes to control is telling me what to do, and I'm doling out those actions. The chorus says, check my vitals. The truth is vile, but vital to the cause. So we have vitals being redone to vital, which two different ideas here, but also rhyming with vile. I gotta give him that one. It's kind of clever. It says, I've been held hostage and captive in a passive shell. Give me clarity, give me something to rely on. You know, just give me something else. Give me a different type of hope. I have nothing, and they have manipulated that. They've weaponized it against me. I need something else. I need a gravity, a clarity, or something to rely on to help me break out of this trance. All right. All right. So this song does support my idea of conflict, the music helping to create this clashing feeling. We'll see if this continues on, or if maybe I'm just picking up patterns in the past that don't necessarily help pushing forward. The next one is called Broadcast Quality. We may run this into Flee the Factory. Let's dive in. Apologies. That is Intermission. I had to go back and find where the lyrics were, because Genius didn't have lyrics for it. And I was about to try to transpose them by ear. And they were kind of tough to do. Lots of textures going on there. So I ended up finding a different website with the lyrics for it. But that's why I'm in the middle of Intermission there. All right, Broadcast Quality is where we're going next. Let's dive in. Oh, why does that immediately put me into the Gravity Falls intro song? Very creepy though. Like a fun kind of eerie. Fun syncopation, chordal change underneath the melody that doesn't change. I can't wait to read what that alliteration was. There's a lot of T's in there. Yeah. Very what's that band with Sonny Moore in it? From first to last. That's what this track reminded me of. as much syncopation in this one as I would expect. It's more of a straightforward rhythmic. Something about spiders and web, very similar to track 2. It's interesting, the density kind of went in the extreme opposites. It feels empty. Kind of lacking the momentum, but also the intensity. Haze. These beautiful endings, dude. There's something digital about this, these vocals, though. We are going to stop it after this one, though. I have some really interesting things to say. This was wild. I mean, first of all, like I said, as far as I literally just got done talking about how this idea of mapping more focused and honed ideas into more chaotic ones, into more honed ones, you can map that onto pretty much every track on the album, and then they give us a song with pretty much no layering at all. The bass, guitars, and drums are pretty much locked into harmonic ideas this entire time. We have some melodic riffs occasionally in here, and then we have the textured guitar stuff in that very eerie breakdown with the quasi-panic chords. They're not quite as panicky as typically we would hear, but definitely focusing on tension and dissonance in those chords. But there's just not a lot of layering in here, even when we hit the peak of the song, which is where we had Casey doing the fry screams. They're not even really screams. It's more like just fry compression on cleans. I'm going to call them screams, but there's not I'd love to hear somebody who has a better ear for nuances. Like, I clearly know what is a fry scream and what is a clean vocal, but this feels a little bit mixed, somewhere in the middle. But I don't know how much of that, I mean, obviously, if you mix them, that's generally dangerous. You either want to go full fry compression or full clean. Using your vocal cords. Mixing them is usually how you damage your vocals, so that's probably not what's going on here, but it's a very smooth transition, and it's pitched too, which feels like there's compression on the clean vocals. So I'm curious about that. It also just kind of lacks the intensity of a post-hardcore scream too. It has the urgency, but not the intensity. It doesn't have the sting, but it does have the ear-catching quality to it, that compression. So Anyways, that part, he's screaming. It's highly repetitive. We're going to touch on that in a second. And we do have group vocals putting haze in there every once in a while, but that's as layered as it gets. That's as dense as it gets. There's no multiple guitar lines alongside. We don't have additional vocal melodies. We just have these vocal stingers. Hey, every once in a while. So we have a track that doesn't match what I just picked up on. And beyond that, kind of went in the exact opposite direction, where I've talked about many of these tracks having dense layering in them. This one just doesn't. It's missing a piano line, it's missing an electronic synth part to it. We don't really have dual guitar lines throughout this. We don't have dual or triple vocal lines. It sets its atmosphere up. It's kind of spooky and eerie, which is a little different for this album. And then it has the vocal line on top of that. And that's kind of it throughout the entirety of the song until it has a full 180 flip at the end and goes for this beautiful vocal a cappella section. So that's, it stands out to me. It's a very different sound in general. And it made me think of different bands too. I've dropped a couple of bands that create similar music, might have been inspiration, might have been inspired by the same things, or were just doing the same things at the same time. But here I dropped From First to Last, which I don't think anything in this album feels like anything that From First to Last was doing, but this one does. But I also get a little touch of I Am Ghost, their second LP, although I would call it their third. I have beef about their first album getting labeled as an EP despite being like 30 minutes and having 12 tracks. To me, that's an LP. That's their debut. But anyways, they had their final album was without some of the members from their previous work, and took on a little bit more of a metal-y feel. It was like a post-hardcore, very light metalcore sounds. And parts of this track remind me of works from that album too. Again, not something I would describe most of this album as sounding like. This stands out. This is a huge deviation in atmosphere, in guitar tone, and in compositional density too. This also features, I think, their heaviest guitar riff as far as angst, possibly, and their most amount of compressed vocals or screaming vocals in it too. So it's interesting. I don't think that I would say it doesn't fit on the album, but it is certainly a sonic outlier on the album. And I'm curious if this is a change for what is to come, or if it will be that one odd track on an album of incredibly similar sounding songs. They've got me doing it now. Similar sounding song. And I think I had a P alliteration before we started this track, or at the beginning of this analysis, something like that. As soon as I said it, I was like, dang, there's like 3 words with the same starting consonant sound. It started, the lyrical writing is starting to infect me. I'm not even doing it on purpose. But the other thing that stands out to me too is something it's been on my periphery. I've noticed it, but I haven't really brought it up yet. Repetition is a key element in this album. There is always, in every single track, a section where the vocals lock into one sentence and then just repeat it over and over and over again. Usually accompanied by a second and even a third vocalist who each have their own sentence that they're hyper-focused on and repeating. And this is what builds out most of the densely layered sections. Basically, we're giving the vocals a riff each. What I find interesting is we can hear it a little bit in this Armistice, but we can certainly hear it here during the spider web binding my body, or whatever that line was. As the vocalist is repeating this line over and over and over, it starts out a little cleaner, gets a little raspier, and then gets into the full compressed scream sound. There is that sonic change happening there, but if you listen to the instrumentation under it, you're going to find buildup there. And I find this really interesting because it basically says, okay, well, you're the vocalist, you're singing words, but we're basically going to give you a guitar riff. We're going to give you an ostinato, a single line that you're going to loop over and over and over. And we're going to build instrumentally around that. And it is something that I don't think has appeared on every single track, but I have heard enough times on this album that I think it's worth bringing up. A lot of the times these sections build into something really big, but the buildup is not necessarily through the vocals. It's through the instrumentation. The drums tend to get louder and more complex and more aggressive through these sections. Guitar lines might start out as just a chord and then grow into melodies that are providing counterpoint to all the chaos that's going on in here. And those melodies might become louder or rise in pitch as they're going through this repetition. And it kind of turns into a little bit of a post-rock buildup, where we have these ideas and then we're going to add these on top of it and these on top of it. And you just kind of build the section up, a single atmosphere. You continue to increase its intensity or its emotional resonance or its size over the course of a minute or so, and then allow that to burst into the next section. Sometimes they don't burst into another section. They use this as the peak, and then when we hit that height, we remove everything and diminish it down, like we saw in Broadcast Quality, as that pushed us into the vocal, the a cappella outro. But it is a common device that I see as this sort of building block approach that normally we would see in instrumental parts. Post-metal and post-rock love to do these sort of slow burn instrumentals, but here the focus is on the vocals being the repetitive part while the instruments build up, which is just something you don't see too often. I think post-hardcore, being punkier, has roots in vocal repetition. There's actually quite a few songs that I can think of, you know, coming from an emo and post-hardcore background and listening to a lot of music within this genre, where, yeah, just lots of repetition in the vocals. Not necessarily with intensity rising instrumentally, though. Usually the intensity rises in the vocals. Maybe they start out quiet and then they get more intense and then they're screaming, or maybe it starts in a lower register and then it goes to a higher register and build intensity that way. But it's usually always the vocals that's increasing. Here, though, it kind of takes that instrumental perspective of allowing the vocals to be the static part while the instruments build. And that's really interesting to me. That is progressive. That is subversive to the genre. It takes a trope that I associate with the style of music and does it in a different way, something that's a little more unexpected. A little more unexpected. Great job with words, Bryan. All right, next up, we have Flee the Factory. Let's dive into this one and see where they take us next. Yeah, this is a lot of energy to come off of the vocal a cappella part. I don't know why I keep saying vocal a cappella. That's what a cappella means. This also has a little bit of bite to it, though. Okay, definitely doesn't have that eerie sound that Broadcast Quality did. Oh, the halftime. Into the double time. This drummer doesn't like to sit still, that's for sure.
Cast me in stride, a simple steel specimen, truly empty down inside.
Oh, I didn't look at the lyrics of Broadcast. We'll do that together, I suppose. I completely forgot about it. Lots of tension in those dyads, though. Okay, there is some bite to this. Dude. Lots of tension and grit to the guitars. Into this levity. That's another ending that just doesn't fit to me. Like, I'm beginning to see how they're exploring this album and being different, being experimental with this sound. And I think I still stand by the fact that it just feels amateurish. The first, like a first time attempt at breaking the bounds of putting your own mark on a style. This is all very clearly post-hardcore. It is quite in line with other bands working within this genre at the time, but they are doing different things with it. 3 vocal lines throughout the first half of this album is very different. We had dual vocals on a lot of the emo and post-hardcore stuff, but in three? Yeah, that's kind of unusual. Having three vocalists at all, three distinct vocalists rather than a main vocalist harmonizing with themselves or putting down an ad-lib track on top of a final chorus or something like that. You know, that was a bit more common. You have one vocalist in the band, they're doing everything. But here we have three vocalists. That's unusual. They're putting down three vocal lines in places. That's unusual. They're introducing electronic sounds. That was something that was being toyed around with in this area, but not quite the way they're doing it. So what is it? Kind of ragtime here on this piano part that kind of turns a bit more classical and then chiptune-ish by the end. Yeah, it's neat. But does it fit the rest of the track? Is this a good finale for this song? I don't think so. It is called Flee the Factory, and I can see the vision of putting factory sounds in here. The heavy compression on these definitely create a very machine-like tone in general. But it just, musically, if we look at the harmony of the finale, if we look at the melody of the finale, none of this really matches with what we were doing. It feels like a totally disparate part that just happened to come in here at the end. And that's how I frequently feel about the more experimental or the genre pushing elements in this track. And I think it's very clear if you listen to this. I don't know how much influence Casey had on the compositional side of things, but you can certainly hear a lot of these same ideas showing up in the Deer Hunter. And I think when you compare this to something like Antimai, which is quite a bit far and away from post-hardcore, but you can still see how the more experimental parts are working within a core rock sound. You can see how Casey has learned over the 20 years or so between this and that, of how to incorporate parts outside of a general sound into the genre you're working within in ways that are synergistic rather than disparate, that are more complementary to your root tones. And again, this certainly feels like a bunch of people the first time they're trying to do this. I think that the post-hardcore sections are well done. It's the moment that they step outside of that and try to do something new that the ideas themselves are consistently good. I like the ending to this. It just doesn't have context for it. It feels randomly thrown in there. And again, I can see the vision. There's a factory sound to it, but it's missing its connection with the rest of the track. Much like with the layered vocal parts in here they sound good, but it's just too chaotic. Maybe you could have done with a little bit less, maybe a bit better production, maybe finding some different notes at specific places within here that might have been a bit more synergistic. It's the little things. I really feel like they really got past the bridge of how to break out of the standard, more iterative sounds. They got outside of that and they have influences elsewhere. Every single time we have an interesting intro or outro or chaotic moment, there is genius there. It's just not executed to the best of their ability. And a lot of that's going to come with experience, which is something they didn't have on this first album. So I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. I do think I'm going to give this album another listen after doing this maybe a bit more casually without trying to digest every single aspect of it, without spending, what are we up to, like 3 hours now, and there's still more music to go, without spending so much time on an album that is so short. I mean, stretching a 70-minute experience into a 3.5, 4 hour, I mean, we still have a couple more tracks to go ahead of us, experience is one, all kind of exhausting, but it also distorts the album itself. So I think listening to it as intended in a more casual experience, knowing what it is and where its limits are and where its weaknesses are, and kind of meeting it on its own terms rather than expecting it to be more than what it is, I do think I'm going to come away from it a bit more favorably. I think right now, as we are nearing the end of this album, I do feel that I am viewing it better than I did starting with it, because I understand what it is and why it doesn't quite hit the way I want it to. I am trying to give them the benefit of the doubt at this point because it is incredibly ambitious, and I do want to positively support that. But it does falter along the way, and that's not for a lack of trying. They've actually tried a lot on this, and some of the ideas just simply didn't stick. But I do appreciate the attempt to do what they did, to have the guts to say, we're going to make something crazy like this. And yeah, I don't quite think it's going to cross the finish line. And it has stumbled a lot on the way here to the end. But these things, despite being elements that aren't necessarily what I would look for in music, it does make it interesting to me. And it is a story worth telling. It is an experience worth having. And sometimes it's the more flawed music that is actually the most interesting to get through. As for this track more specifically, it kind of captures some of the same broadcast quality elements of being eerier and edgier. The guitar tone here is sharper than most of the other tracks. It certainly doesn't have uplifting elements or lighter elements to it. A lot of this album has been kind of trying to find uplift and positivity in darker themes, in contrast, in conflict, to still rise out of that. And broadcast quality was just kind of eerie, and this one is crushing. The guitar tones are a bit sharper, the riffs themselves and the note choices don't invoke the brighter elements. We don't have the piano in here to induce that. We don't have the synth tones in the background that would be brighter or uplifting. We don't have bells in this one. We just don't have a lot of brightness at all. It's just kind of heavy throughout. But it also, much like broadcast quality, is a bit flatter. We don't have the densely layered sections in this one. We do have some nice harmonies, but they seem to be put on specific syllables, usually the end of a melodic line, more so than in the middle, more so than fully harmonic lines. So I found that to be really interesting, that we are kind of flattening out the tracks here. And I wonder if the lack of expansion is something that they're exploring thematically, that the clashing at the beginning of the album has been something that they've wanted to rise out of. The clash comes from aspiration, whereas here the clashing seems to be beating them down. There is no more hope, at least not in these two tracks. We still have 3 ahead of us, but this is a drastic departure from the general blueprint that this album has been using. And I find that interesting. I do find Flee the Factory maybe to be one of my, I feel bad saying favorite tracks, because I do feel like it's their least adventurous song. There are some interesting texture things in here that we would end up seeing alternative metal and even metalcore, melodic metalcore, veering towards. We had, again, some kind of panic chord ideas in this track. So it's more textured than the rest, which is, this has been a very melodic album so far. And these two tracks have kind of focused on atmosphere and texture over melody, which is interesting. They focus on linear vocal writing rather than the densely layered vocal writing. And they focus on darker atmospheres rather than trying to find beauty and uplift within heavier atmospheres. This one's just kind of statically dark. So it's an interesting turn here that all happened after Intermission. I guess this Armistice also had some brighter uplifting parts to it too. So maybe it wasn't exactly after the Intermission, but it is a different element here. And then, like I said, we've wrapped the track up with some compressed sounds that kind of feel machine-like, very industrial. What's interesting is between the piano and then the shift to highly compressed sounds, it actually reminds me of a track by Danny Baranowski, I think is the name of the composer, for the original Super Meat Boy game. The song was called Sacrificial, and the original version was a piano line. But then there was also a chiptune version where the word sacrificial had like numbers replacing letters, and the L was like a pipe symbol with an underscore next to it. And moving into the compressed sounds here actually reminded me of that chiptune version of the track too. So that was really interesting parallel here. This album does make me think of a lot of other music, which is a blessing and a curse. It's certainly reminding me of a lot of music that I enjoy. But sometimes it also reminds me of something that I think I'd prefer to be listening to. All right, since I forgot, let's dive into some lyrics for broadcast quality, and then we'll check out Flee the Factory's lyrics. All right. Broadcast quality is sort of in line with The Evidence, which is interesting because they share lyrics too. If The Evidence was about knowing something that powerful people didn't want you to know, didn't want spread out into the world, and they were hunting you down in order to erase that information, we kind of see the same thing here. We have somebody who is hiding and is found. They are found by, I kind of read it as a type of femme fatale archetype of a character. It's a woman who uses her sexuality or attraction in order to tie up our narrator in a web. At the very beginning, it says, "How did you know to find me here? Tipped off, you tiptoed to the tune of tapped wires and insider information." When I heard this in the track, I was like, I can't wait to find out what was actually said there. So yeah, we have a cool little a T alliteration going on there. But even at the end, we have tapped wires and insider information. Wires and insider being very soft rhymes, but it does work. The chorus says, "Fix your broken eyes on me," she said, as she draped her arms around my head. But her wrists felt more like rope as they grazed my neck, and her fingers like spiders spun a web my body couldn't shed. So basically the idea is, rest your weary head, creating a place of comfort for our narrator, but it's obvious that this person doesn't have the best intent for our narrator. It says that as her arms draped around my neck, it felt like a rope. It says, "In her fingers like spiders spun a web my body couldn't shed." This idea of the spider web that you can't shed was present at the end of The Evidence as well. It was the final repeated phrase on that one. Sort of like how it is here too. It is the final repeated phrase. We'll be hearing a lot of that. That's about this. That's about all to this one. Verse 2 says, "On the eve of battle, I'll lay these arms to rest. I'll have my subordinate coordinates finally turn themselves in, transmitted and encoded, but encryptions have eroded. Now my whereabouts are living in the airwaves thanks to me." So he was found out because he didn't have enough due diligence in hiding where he was when he transmitted this information. So the broadcast quality, well, I suppose it's the security of the broadcast quality. It wasn't up to snuff. That's all the lyrics in here up until the ahs and oohs and woos and wahs at the end of the track, the a cappella section. So yeah, it is interesting. I'm curious if maybe there isn't a connective narrative here, or if they're simply using common themes and evoking the two tracks by having similar lyrics within them. Once again, though, we do have this contrast, this clashing between the two people, what they want. But that one also kind of lyrically isn't as dense as the others either. It's very straightforward, it tells its story, and honestly, a vast majority of this is either the "Fix Your Broken Eyes on Me" chorus or the her fingers like spiders spun a web that we see several times repeated in this track. The verses, which have unique lines in them, they take up such a small part of the lyrics. Much like broadcast quality, bringing up elements of the evidence in it, we also see a thematic similarity between Flee the Factory and this Armistice. We have somebody who has different wants than what they are actively doing. There is a schism between what they want or what they need and the actions they're actually taking. There's also an element of puppetry or marionette in here as well, but it's done through the lens of robotics. This factory is about creating robots or maybe cyborgs, I don't know. And our narrator has grown sentience, maybe breaking against their code or remembering their human side if it is a cyborg factory. Regardless, they talk about feeling who they are beneath the code, beyond the wires, and wishing that they could be more than that, or more than what they are, more than what they're programmed to be. The chorus says that it's easier to bow than to keep these knees locked tight like the rivets in my skin. My pulse reverberates through this malleable shell. So the programming to bow to someone else to show subservience is easier than to keep the muscles locked tight. Basically says that in this body, the mind control, the programming, whatever you want to call it, is so powerful that it's impossible to resist, but that there is something of themselves that they can feel. They call it the pulse that reverberates through the shell. They also call it a malleable shell, something that can be molded. So there is an element of hope here that they will eventually be able to transform their body, their mind, into something that serves them rather than serves a master. The verses basically bring in a lot of code and wires and circuitry, robotic element, vocabulary. Says one hoped that they would break the patent when they die cast me in stride, a simple steel specimen truly emptied down inside. With copper core wound veins, a pumping cold hydraulic heart, bellows cycle air on rhythms fixed within my code. Verse 2 says my insides grind like gears, abrasive and churning, I'm so conductive. It's always been a task with such low impedance. Which is interesting because that is both talking about how there's little resistance to the actions themselves, but also electrical impedance is the resistance of an electrical current. Might be a little too layman's when I described it that way, but I'm not an electrician, so I did have to take some of that in college. Physics too, man. That was a rough one, but I did learn about electrical impedance. Anyways, though, I thought that was nice. A little bit of a duality there, talking about the resistance within while still using this secondary definition of it for electrical terms, which we are talking about robots in this case. So that was really well done. Very clever. Says that he just wishes that he'll flee the factory, though. The end of it says, someone find my maker, I'm coming apart at the seams, I'll cauterize myself back together again. Very straightforward, another track that doesn't have densely layered sections, and much like Flee the Factory is mostly focusing on these choruses, these core repeated ideas, where the verses are a bit shorter and just take up less space within the song itself. Now, this was the track that had Anthony Green on vocals, and I didn't hear him, which is comical because back at the beginning of this analysis, the beginning of this entire video, I had mentioned that the vocalists within the band are so similar that I can't really tell them apart, but Anthony Green's coming up later, and I'm sure I'm going to recognize his voice. Here's the wild thing. I'm looking at the lyrics, and the lyrics use italics, bold, and then bold italics to differentiate between different groups or singles of people. There's lots of places in here where we have harmonies. Anthony Green appears to only show up 3 times on this song. The first 2 are in choruses 1 and 2. It is on the very last word, shell. And in the outro, he harmonizes with Brandon this time. He harmonized with Alex previously, but he harmonizes with Brandon on the word shell. That's it. They got Anthony Green to come in and maybe sing 1 word and then just put that into every spot, but maybe had 2 recordings here, once for the chorus and once for the outro. They got him to sing a single note and then put him as a featured vocalist on this track. It blows my mind. Completely underutilized here. And I vaguely remember, I think it was the last time that we heard the word shell. I was like, dude, that's a high pitched note. Whoever's hitting that, congrats, they just hit it. Of course, it was Anthony Green doing that. I don't think I would put it past the others. I think they could if they wanted to, but I just find it really interesting that like, hey, Anthony, you want to sing a note for us on one of our songs? A single note, a single syllable within this entire track absolutely blows my mind. Why? What was even the point of it? I don't know, dude. It's such a bizarre choice. But if I got hung up on every single bizarre choice on this album, we'd be here all day. This next track is called Dead Men Tell No Tales. Let's dive into it. Oh, it's 6. Okay. So it feels like it's in groups of 3, but we're actually in 4/4. Yep. Easily heard when the drums come in. Hear the drummer constantly jumping back and forth between full-time and halftime?
Water
Okay, okay. All right, all right, all right, all right. Dude, I'm so excited about this one. I think this is my favorite track off the album because it really feels like they're pushing the bounds while reining it in enough to do something cohesive. Everything in this works. We have dense vocal parts, but never too many lines happening all at the same time. In fact, I would almost say that the chorus, I don't think I understand the structure of this song really well yet. But I think it's the chorus has bouncing vocal parts. They're all over the place. We have a center, we have one panned out to either side. Sometimes there's a scream, there's call and response. But I think what stands out most to me in this section is Hawk It. And I think it's a device that they really could have used more of in this album to open up space in some sections. Here, I can feel the intensity of having all of these vocals present, which feels like some of the other sections in this album where we have 3 melody lines going off, that really dense counterpoint. But the thing is that there's enough trade-off, enough space between each of the individual lines, and I think that at no point in time are there more than 2 individual melodies going off at any one moment. If all 3 vocalists are present, something's being harmonized. And it gives it this intensity and this presence, and it draws your ears to it, but it isn't overly complicated. It isn't taking up too much space, and it's working well within the production that they have. Again, I'm going to go back and say this again. I really think the first half of this album would shine with clearer production. I don't think it's a compositional issue with some of those earlier songs. It just is really muddy the way that it's done. Definitely something that could be fixed in a remaster of this album. Or if it had just been created in a different era. The early 2000s were not a great time to create music that was of the time, unless you really wanted to use a lot of compression and muddy sounds. I don't know what it was. We loved muddy production back then. Everything was just really gritty. Not a fan of it in retrospect, but it worked for me back in the day, I guess. Anyways, though, here it all comes together. The composition is reined in enough to work within this production style. Well, without giving up the intensity or urgency felt by having so many people singing simultaneously. Having vocalists trade off parts of a sentence, creating the Hawk It, elevates this in a way that having multiple moving lines in the past simply haven't. And I think it's perfect here. Casey throwing in those screams occasionally really elevates these sections too. You can feel a type of desperation in these moments. Everyone else is singing their hearts out, interrupting each other, finishing each other's sentences, while Casey's just screaming in the background with this long held out note, which becomes kind of drone-ish, which allows it to kind of back out of the way of the spotlight a little bit, and that helps open up space for other vocal lines. It's just so well done. Dancing between call and response, or trading off sections or Hawk It's, and then introducing harmonies in there too. Maybe you have vocalist 1 and then vocalist 2, and then they both come together to sing the final bit of the sentence or something like that. It's just, it is tastefully done. Incredible. And I heard some of the lyrics, and what stood out to me was that I'm pretty sure these were the lyrics from Intermission. There were a lot of seafaring vocabulary present in here. I heard abandoned ship. I heard captain overboard or something like that. And the more I listen to the music, there's a lot of toms in this track, more so than most of the others. This has been a pretty snare and cymbal heavy album. And that's not to say that we don't have any snare and cymbal in this. We certainly do, but there's quite a few sections where it's just tom runs. And this feels heavy. It feels weighty. It feels crushing, especially when you bring in high reverb guitars. The combination of these two create the feeling of drowning. And we actually had this about 3 minutes into the track, and I thought this was going to be the outro of the song, but it ended up being the bridge, and then we had a return to the chorus at the end, which kind of brought back some of the less watery sounds overall. The guitars went back to what they were doing, and the drums went back to their snare and ride cymbal stuff. But for a moment, it really feels like going under, the water rising above you, everything becoming muffled and reverberant. And it definitely creates this watery feeling. We also had the really odd time signature in here, which, well, I mean, the time signature is 4/4, but the groupings of the rhythms themselves felt like it was in 3. It took me a few times through to realize that it was actually 16 beats. And it's like, oh snap, this, that's divisible by 4. We're probably in 4/4 here. But it just doesn't feel that way. It feels like it should be in 3, and 3 is a very common watery time signature. The waltz is big for portraying water. And that works its way in here too. We have the schism. Obviously, if the lyrics are the same ones as Intermission, we have a clash between the people who wanted to keep the ship going, and then the person who left them all behind, who traded their lungs for canteens, I think the line was. So we have this clash here, and rhythmically, the rhythmic devices within the melody are clashing with the time signature. We have this feeling of underwater and drowning that goes well with the nautical themes of the lyrics. And the track ends with a short movement into the next track that brought back some of the watery elements, brought back the reverb on the guitars for like the 10 seconds it took. It wasn't this long detached outro that felt like nothing else in the song. It was still a thematically appropriate ending, but it fit with the music too. I think the only negative aspect I could say about this is that it does feel more generic, more iterative. It is thematically experimental or progressive, but it isn't technically progressive. So I kind of have a tough time wanting to elevate this and like, oh, this is my favorite song. This is the most cohesive thing they wrote, when it is also the most iterative thing they wrote. It's kind of tough to point at this as the best the album has when it's also the least creative. I don't think it's the right word, but it's the least unique. But it is the one that feels like every piece of the puzzle fits, and the resulting picture is incredibly clear in a way that this album hasn't always been. And so I think for those reasons alone, it's definitely worth pointing to and discussing and highlighting, even if I don't think it's the most adventurous one on the album. But I do think it's my favorite so far, just because everything just clicks. And as expected, this is a song about being betrayed, as these lyrics indicated from the intermission. It talks about a type of revenge. It says, I'll flood the ground and I swear on your grave I'll bury this town. The chorus is the stanza from Intermission. We've tested the buoyancy of loyalty. You left our lungs for canteens. You left our ankles for anchors. We thought your arms were tied behind your back, but elastic bands tie your hands. I think I understand that line now. The idea of having your hands tied behind, the idea of having your arms tied is basically saying that you don't have much sway in this. There's a higher power that's forcing you to do this, which is lining up well with the themes of the album, what you want to do and what you have to do, or what you're being made to do. But it says that we found out that the bands were elastic, and I think that's what I missed last time. They can just be stretched, and then you can sneak your arms out. So you weren't actually bound by anything. You could have done whatever you wanted. The second verse says, abandoned ship. Our captain is overboard. He punctured holes in the floorboards to flood the bow just in time to bow out. So from floorboards to flood the bow to bow out. This one I think kind of dances the line between clever and cheesy. So I'm going to give it to him just for being a bit more clever than some of the other ones. But then later it also says that he's overboard and overboard. And you kind of lost me on that one. To be overly bored is... It's a weird way to phrase that, just so that you can have this overboard and overboard thing going on. Then it says, in the wake we man our own driftwood, orphanage, a second-hand sailor's fleet to flee. So despite what you did, despite you sinking the ship purposefully, we still have a little mini ship, a driftwood orphanage. We are still together, even if it is just on driftwood, and we're getting to land. Without you, it seems. It does say that there's nothing you can do when water ruins the maps we drew. Save us from this drowning vessel. So there is this feeling of, we had plans and now we can't go through it. That we're alive. We're going to still do what we want, but we've got to figure new ways to do that now. So again, it's just basically about a group of people being betrayed by one of them, and using this idea of a nautical theme to support that. There is a genius contribution here. It says that the song is a response to the former frontmen who left the band, and that frontman would eventually respond with a song of his own in his new band. So I guess this was just a song about having beef with someone. And, yeah, it does that pretty well without really pointing any fingers, which I think is always a bit classier than just directly calling someone out in your music, which always feels like a perversion of art to me. But maybe that's just the way I feel about it. Here we are moving into the penultimate track, Venona. We'll probably run this into Epilogue as well, since I believe Epilogue is only 3 minutes long. And then it has like 10 minutes of silence and then a hidden track. So I think that's going to be a bit on the shorter side. I will say, though, Dead Men Tell No Tales is another straightforward track. There's not a lot of density in it, which is, what I was talking about, finding a nice medium point. And it continues on with this idea that kind of post-intermission, it's a different album. With only 2 songs left, I wonder if they're going to continue on with this trend. Let's dive into this, the nautical theme, and find out. Oh, another really tense one. No optimism. Oh, okay. Interesting decision on how we got out of that chorus. but they're not going to split it again. So much tension. Oh, okay. At least this brings back one of the melodies from previously. Very cool arpeggiation there. It felt a little classical inspired, something we haven't heard too much of on the album. Isn't that the line from the second track that I couldn't figure out? The prison break? Yeah, there's that optimism we've been missing for a while. Another section, highly repetitive, mostly focusing on bringing in a lot of vocal layers. Dang, that was 3 minutes already? All right, I'm gonna skip forward a bit. I don't remember exactly where this track starts.
Oh, how I've been teething in light of your misleading. You caused this collapse between the heart and the synapse. Oh, how I've been teething.
Yeah, so this came from, was this Flee the Factory? Or Armistice, I think it was. I don't have a lot to add to Venona. I'm looking forward to checking out the lyrics on that one, but generally speaking, it fits in with the back half of this album really well. It brought in a little bit of uplift in it, but nothing like we saw at the beginning of Epilogue, which really was a return to the sound of the beginning of this album, harmonically speaking. Anyways, it also had less dense vocal work on it, but I do think it had, kind of like Dead Man Tell No Tales, some of the better screaming work on this album. But again, just a rather straightforward, darker song overall that focused on, once again, noise. I think that it is a good song to add to the collection of the back half of this album, and I do still find it really interesting that this album is split in half. And this kind of takes me to Epilogue, which is probably the most clearest example of what this album is doing. We have 3 minutes of beautiful, gorgeous, layered, optimistic, uplifting vocal harmonies. Incredibly dense, great stuff going on there. And then silence, and then at the end we have the inverse of that. Now this is still incredibly dense since a lot of it is a cappella. The vocals have to contribute everything that's being played. But it is nowhere near as heightened. I don't think it is a perfect representation of the back half of the album, but it does feel more grounded in a way that the first half of Epilogue doesn't. It is incredibly dense though, and a lot of times, once again, I think the production is getting in the way of the genius of what's going on here. There is some really cool counterpoint in play here, and it's just really tough to hear it as all the vocals are kind of melding together into this conglomerate sound. Especially with the lower sound, something about, I think that was the puppets line, we are puppets, and off on the sides, it was too muddied, not clear and crisp enough, and it was blending in with everything else. I think the only thing that really stood out there with enough space was the falsetto work. I don't know what they were singing, but it was incredibly clear in the mix against everything else. But it was more grounded, more rooted, less uplifting than the first part of Epilogue. And so I kind of thought it would be a bonus track, but I don't think it is. It wouldn't work by itself. It is a part of the album. And in a lot of ways, the puppets and marionettes line, I gotta read the rest of the lyrics because there's so many lines going on there. But at least that one does come from the back half, but the Last Night in My Body comes from the first half. So the lyrics, at least some of the lyrics from the first part of Epilogue come from the first half of the album, and at least some of the lyrics from the end of Epilogue come from the second half of the album. This whole concept of duality here continues to resonate between the heart and the synapse. Between the heart and the mind, although synapse is also an electronic, not like a robotic term, probably because robots, we would want them to think like we do, so probably creating electronic synapses. So we have the heart and the mind, but also the humanity and the robotic, this schism of what we want versus what we're doing. This is consistent throughout. Also, the hope of the first half versus the eeriness or darkness of the second half. There's just this constant contrast. And we're seeing that in the Epilogue too. I don't know that I have a strong thesis for what I think all of this is supposed to mean. At this point, I see the patterns and I have a hypothesis, which is this idea of, wants versus needs, puppetry versus self-control. And they're exploring that quite a bit of ways. But then we get something like Dead Man Tell No Tales, and I mean, that's basically just a hit piece song. That's a beef track right there. There is conflict in it, but it is certainly less along the thematic lines that I'm seeing elsewhere, which makes me wonder if maybe there's some lyrical themes from the first half of the album that I'm just forgetting, that I've omitted from my memory because they didn't match the patterns I've been seeing. So maybe there is something like Dead Men Tell No Tales in the first half. And if there is, that certainly cuts into this. Well, if that's the theme of the album, where do these songs fit? But it is a consistent part of this track is a division, a duality, a plurality. Of focusing on two sides and trying to find the point in the middle. Epilogue has silence in its middle, but the album has the intermission in its middle. And through this midpoint, there is a clear division between what happens before it and what happens after it. We can also look at the end of Epilogue, bringing in the digitized voice, that very buzzy, robotic kind of sound alongside the more natural human voices that sing around it. It's also the one that leaves first in the a cappella set once the drums are gone, which the drums also bring a digital edge to them, but we lose the drums, then we lose the robotic voice, and we're left with just these human tones. And maybe that says something too. I don't know. Final thoughts here before we hit the lyrics. Much like any good prog album, this one is not one you can just grasp immediately. And it's quite possible that some of the things, and maybe even all of the things that I held against it, I have talked about it having missteps and tripping over its own feet quite a few times on this album. It's possible that with time, as I begin to understand the album more, I see those less as mistakes and more as competent elements to further the thematic components of the album. There have certainly been albums in the past where I kind of walk away from the first time thinking, well, that just wasn't very well done. And then later on, they end up being one of my favorite albums. And it's simply because I didn't grasp what they were laying down that first time through. And progressive music, experimental music, avant-garde music, anything that kind of pushes outside the realms of the norm are going to be ones that are more difficult to pick up on that first time through and are the easiest to bounce off of someone. So I do want to put that out there. I have had my critiques of this album and criticisms about it, but that's just from a first time listen, and it's possible that those opinions and observations may change. I guess the observations are true. It's just what I took from those ideas that might change my opinions of them over time as I give it more listens. And I do think I will. The first half still kind of bounced off me a bit. Maybe I'll soften to that with repeat listens, but the back half stands out to me as really well done. But it exists in opposition. Its purpose is clear to be a different point of view from the beginning of the album. This idea of duality is consistent everywhere on this album. So maybe hearing the beginning again in relationship and pertaining to what I know about the end, have a very different relationship to those first few songs on a second listen. I quite enjoyed this though. I'm always a sucker for harmonies and dual vocals, much less three vocals, trio vocals. I love it. You guys know that's my cup of tea right there. Even if the production here kind of obscures the genius sometimes, I love that they went for it. And this is my home genre, dude. The guitar riffs just sound right. The chord progressions and note choices just sound right. I feel at home in a lot of this, but they still find ways to surprise me around most corners. So I did really enjoy this, and I don't know where I would put this against The Earth Sings Me Fa Mi. I think I'd have to give that another listen before I ranked them, but I do think that the Receiving End of Sirens is a really great band, and I'm kind of disappointed that I didn't hear them in their heyday. I think 17-year-old me would have gone crazy for this. I'm a little bit more selective about what I listen to these days, and production value is certainly something that I've come to appreciate more over time than I did back then. But this album, I would have gone bonkers for it, dude. it would have been like the album in my CD player for months. It is still also interesting to compare this to the Deer Hunter, and that just reminds me that I need to dig into them too. I hate making early announcements, but the Act 1 reaction will be done this year. I don't want to give any more concrete date because I've already missed that several times in the past. But I'm working towards that. I have a goal in mind. I just got to figure out when to find the time to do it. So it'll be interesting to hear those earlier, the Deer Hunter things, now that I've heard this, which Casey, again, I don't know how big of an influence he had in the composition, but I can see how something like this evolved into the Deer Hunter. All right, let's wrap this up. Let's hit some lyrics for these two tracks. I actually don't know what Venona is about. The beginning sets a scene, men waiting patiently to remove me from the scene, a sea of faceless souls in suits, a sight for eyes, like thumbs, sore and crooked. To remove me from the scene. So there's a bunch of people in suits. They're waiting patiently to remove our narrator. And then it says, you have been exposed. Takes us into the chorus. Your eyes speak well of you. They play my requiem to a closed casket burial. Your conspiracy conspiring to deliver me to the authorities. I have been betrayed so graciously. So our narrator has been found out, which was actually what we heard in broadcast quality. Says that they've been betrayed and that the authorities that conspired to get him have won. But then it says, my bloodhounds are hooked on a trail of ink which led me to the words you scribbled down, an obituary dedicated to me, submit before coming. So either we've had a perspective change here, or our narrator, who was being hunted, also had a trail to hunt someone else. I don't know. We have a repeated line, might as well be blind with isolated eyes like mine. This could represent the fact that after the men in suits pulled him from the scene, he was imprisoned somewhere, so he's isolated, but it could just be like blinders, focused vision, only have one goal in mind, and so he wasn't aware of what was around him. We have a bridge that says, your fingers are star-crossed lovers that can't seem to get enough of each other. This pantomime dialect doesn't practice what you preach. Now, I'm not sure about the fingers that can't seem to get enough of each other. Star-crossed lovers is Romeo and Juliet. We're going to touch on that in a second. But the pantomime dialect doesn't practice what you preach basically says that you put up a pretty good show and people follow you, but you don't actually believe anything that you're saying. Now, what that has to do with anything else, I don't really know. The final part of this song brings back the first line of the chorus, but then brings back a line from Then I Defy You, Stars. It says, your eyes speak well of you. Blur your eyes and bend the lines. Do you like what you see, O Romeo? And this really has me confused. What is this about? As the penultimate song, it seems to be following up with some of the themes we have about trying to evade people who want you dead or captured at least. And this is our narrator finally getting caught, although they were also caught in broadcast quality, so maybe this is more of a thematic continuance than a narrative continuance. But why do we have the tie-backs to the Romeo and Juliet stuff from Then I Defy You, Stars? We have a direct lyrical bringing back, a callback, but then we also have the star-crossed lovers line, which kind of sets up this direct callback. It immediately makes you think of Romeo and Juliet, and then moments later you get hit with the line that directly references the Romeo and Juliet track. I don't understand any of this. within the album, within itself. The perspective changes. I'm lost on it. Which then takes us to Epilogue, which is pretty much what I had caught on to. The first part of it is "This is the last night in my body," and then a second vocal is saying "somehow for now the skin will have to do," which still I don't understand what that has to do with the jailbreak scene, but it actually comes in from a different perspective when you look at it through the lens of puppetry, of roboticism, wanting to be more than what you can be or what you're forced to be. You want a different body, a different mind, less strings on you. For now, this body will have to do, but eventually I need more. Again, I don't think I read it any differently within the jailbreak song itself, but within the themes of the album, it stands out as a pretty strong line, and I'm glad they brought it back, especially having experienced the rest of the themes in this album. The last part of Epilogue brings back "how I've been teething in light of your misleading. You've caused this collapse between the heart and the synapse," which, yeah, that needs to come back. That's the album title. It's also a really strong thematic element here about the division between wants, needs, and action. But then we also bring back "tell me who's pulling the strings. We're all puppets, we're all marionettes." This brings back the concept of manipulation into all of this, which just asks another question: do we have free will in anything we do? Even if we got a new skin, a new body, would we be any freer? The album doesn't feel like answering that, but at least to me it does sort of a little nudge, nudge, wink, wink in that direction. I'm curious if they intended for that, or if maybe that's just something I'm taking out of this. But I do think it's interesting that that's the last thing we hear. The opening of the epilogue brings back the idea of wanting more, wanting a different body with less strings on it. And the very last lines we hear is "we are all puppets. We are all marionettes. No matter what we do, we will be controlled somehow." Interesting way to wrap this up. I don't think I have any thoughts beyond this. It's kind of left me in a thoughtful state. I think it's going to sit with me for a little bit, and I'll come back to this album in a week or so. Put a little bit of distance between me and it so I can forget some things about it, and dive into it again from a more casual perspective and see where I sit with it. For now then, these are my thoughts on the Receiving End of Sirens, Between the Heart and the Synapse. Let me know what you thought of this. If there's anything that stood out to you, anything that you'd like to add on to what I said, or correct me on if you have your own take, perspective, or opinion on this. Put all that into the comment section below, as well as anything else you'd like to add to the conversation. Above that, in the description box, is a link for Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. I'll be back tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. UTC. We're going to do a live stream. Usually goes for about 2.5 hours. We just chill, chit chat, listen to some music. We have 13 songs queued up for it. If you come in anytime during that 2.5 hour stream, you're going to find some good conversation. You're going to find some good music. It's just a really chill, relaxed, great way to spend a Sunday. If you can make it, I highly suggest you do. Otherwise, I'll be back Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.